The rain fell over the city like it was trying to wash away its sins. For most people, it was just another Tuesday. But for Richard Hemsley, billionaire CEO of Hemsley Global Holdings, it was the day his world and his pride were about to collide with someone he thought was beneath him. Richard leaned back in the back seat of his black Bentley, scrolling through emails on his tablet. His driver, a quiet man in his mid-40s, sat up front, steady hands on the wheel. "Turn left here," Richard said without looking up. The driver obeyed. Moments later, Richard frowned. "You're late again, Arthur." "I arrived at the usual time, sir," the driver replied calmly. "Traffic was heavier than expected." Richard scoffed. "Excuses. You drivers always have excuses. You get paid to be invisible, not opinionated." Arthur didn't respond. He'd learned that silence often protected dignity better than words ever could. The rest of the drive passed in quiet tension, but Richard couldn't resist adding, "You know, Arthur, people who drive others usually do so because they have nowhere better to go." Arthur's eyes flickered in the rearview mirror for a moment, a glance sharp enough to cut glass, but then softened again. "Maybe, sir, or maybe we go exactly where we're meant to." Richard didn't like that answer, not because it was rude, but because it felt true. When they arrived at the private equity gala, Richard stepped out into a sea of flashbulbs and applause. Cameras adored him, investors followed him. He was the man who turned every handshake into a profit. Arthur parked the car at the edge of the lot, waiting patiently under the rain. He'd seen these nights 100 times: champagne, arrogance, false smiles. Inside, Richard charmed the crowd, shaking hands with other magnates and politicians. Every few minutes he'd glance toward the window where Arthur waited by the car. He wasn't sure why, perhaps irritation, perhaps something else. By midnight, when Richard returned to the car, his mood had turned sour. A rival had hinted at an acquisition that might outbid him. Failure, even the idea of it, was poison. "Drive," he snapped. Arthur did. Halfway home, the car hit a pothole, splashing mud across the windshield. Richard slammed his tablet shut. "Useless roads, useless government, useless—" Arthur's voice interrupted quietly. "Sir, do you ever rest?" Richard looked up, surprised. "Excuse me?" "You work like you're trying to outrun something," Arthur said softly. "Most men only do that when they're afraid to stop." Richard's face hardened. "You forget your place, Arthur." Arthur nodded once, his gaze steady. "Yes, sir, maybe I do." They drove the rest of the way in silence, but for the first time it wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, electric, like a truth hanging in the air waiting to be named. The next morning, Richard stormed into his office, barking orders before he even reached his desk. His assistant followed behind nervously. "Sir, there's something you should know," she said. "Arthur called in to say he won't be driving you today." Richard frowned. "He what?" "He said it was personal business." "Personal business?" Richard repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "The man chauffeurs billionaires for a living. What personal business could he possibly have?" She hesitated. "He didn't say." Richard rolled his eyes. "Find me another driver, and tell Arthur if he wants to keep his job, he'd better be back tomorrow." That evening, Richard attended another event, this time a charity auction for disadvantaged children. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he mingled with politicians, a familiar face entered the room. Arthur, not in a driver's uniform, not even in a suit. He wore a simple grey shirt and jeans, his hair slightly damp from the rain. Richard's jaw clenched. "What is he doing here?" he muttered. Arthur didn't seem to notice him. Instead, he walked straight to the stage and whispered something to the event organizer. A moment later, the host tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, "before we begin tonight's auction, we have a special message from one of our most generous, anonymous donors." Richard froze. Arthur stepped forward, holding a small photo, a group of children smiling in front of a newly built school. "This," Arthur began, "is the reason I work." His voice was calm, but carried a quiet authority that drew every eye. "I've driven cars for men who owned the world," he said. "But most of them never stopped to see the world they owned. I work so that these children, the ones who come from nothing like I did, never feel invisible." The room fell silent. Even the rain outside seemed to stop listening. He paused. "Tonight, every donation you make will go to building another school. Not in my name, but in theirs." Applause erupted. Richard stood motionless, his glass halfway to his lips. His throat felt dry. Arthur stepped down from the stage and walked straight past him, polite, quiet, composed. "Arthur!" Richard called out. The man turned. Richard searched for words, but all that came out was, "You never said—" Arthur smiled faintly. "You never asked." Then he walked away. That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, replaying the words over and over. You never asked. He had spent years talking at people, never to them. He'd built empires, but never bridges. And somehow the man he'd looked down on every day had built something far greater: hope. For the first time in years, Richard didn't sleep well. The next morning, Richard's office felt colder than usual. He sat behind his glass desk, a cup of untouched coffee beside him, eyes fixed on a name typed across his screen: Arthur Dean. He couldn't stop thinking about that night, the driver standing on that stage, speaking like a man with nothing to prove. The calm confidence in his voice, the applause that followed, the quiet sting in Richard's chest. He told himself it was curiosity, not guilt, but curiosity is often just guilt wearing a disguise. "Get me everything you can on Arthur Dean," Richard told his assistant. "Employment records, financial statements, background checks, all of it." The assistant hesitated. "Is he in trouble?" "No," Richard said flatly. "I just like to know who I've been chauffeured around by for the past 2 years." By afternoon, a folder arrived on his desk. He opened it, expecting to find a standard file: middle-class background, no education, maybe some debts. Instead, what he found made him stop breathing. Name: Arthur Dean, education, Oxford University, economics and philosophy. Previous positions: senior investment advisor, Hemsley Global Holdings, 2008-2014, CFO, Redwood Children's Foundation, 2014-2019. Current occupation: private driver. Richard blinked, his pulse rising. Wait, advisor? CFO? He dug deeper through the file. There were handwritten notes from HR. Resigned voluntarily, declined severance, left without explanation. And a final line that caught his eye. Referred by Mr. Richard Hemsley himself. He leaned back slowly in his chair. "I hired him," he whispered. That evening, Richard drove himself for once, the first time in years. The city outside was the same blur of headlights and rain, but it looked different when you were the one holding the wheel. He pulled up outside Arthur's small apartment building, a modest brick structure tucked between a bakery and an old church. Arthur opened the door before he could knock. He didn't seem surprised. "Didn't expect to see you here," Arthur said. "Or driving yourself." Richard held up the folder. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Arthur studied him quietly. "Would it have mattered?" "Yes," Richard said sharply. "You were an advisor. You had power, influence. You worked for me." Arthur sighed. "And that's exactly why I left." Richard frowned. "You left? People don't just walk away from what you had." Arthur leaned against the doorframe. "You ever notice, sir, how men like you think the same thing about happiness?" Richard blinked. "You think people walk away from success," Arthur continued, "but sometimes success walks away from you." He stepped aside. "You can come in if you want, but I'm not sure you'll like what you find." Inside, the apartment was small but spotless. There were books stacked neatly on the floor: philosophy, finance, even theology. On the wall hung photos: smiling children, handwritten notes, pictures of schools in poor neighborhoods. Richard glanced around. "This is where you live?" Arthur poured 2 cups of tea. "It's where I sleep. Where I live. That's out there." He gestured to the photos. "You left a career to build schools?" Richard asked. "To build people," Arthur corrected. "The schools are just the walls." Richard shook his head. "But why work as a driver?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Because sometimes, to understand the road, you have to sit behind the wheel, not in the back seat." Richard felt the words land deep. Arthur handed him the tea. You know, you once told me that drivers have nowhere better to go. Richard froze. Arthur looked at him. Not angry, just tired. That's when I knew you'd never been where I've been. Silence filled the room. For the first time in his adult life, Richard didn't have a response. He set the cup down. Arthur, what happened between us? Why did you leave Hemsley Global? Arthur's expression darkened slightly. Do you really want to know? I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Arthur nodded slowly. Then you should sit down. Richard obeyed. Arthur took a deep breath. 8 years ago, the company approved a merger that collapsed an entire community. Do you remember the Blackridge deal? Richard frowned. Of course, it was one of our biggest profits. And one of our biggest mistakes, Arthur said quietly. That deal destroyed over 3,000 jobs. Teachers, nurses, small businesses. I tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. Richard's heart pounded. I don't recall. I was in your office, Arthur said. You were on a call. I told you the numbers didn't add up, that the deal would cripple half the city. You said, and I quote, people adapt or disappear. That's business. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. I left that day, Arthur continued. I took what savings I had and built something that helped the people your company forgot. Richard's voice cracked. Why come back then? Why drive me? Arthur looked at him evenly. Because forgiveness isn't found in running away. Sometimes you have to face the man you used to be. The two men sat in silence. Rain tapped softly on the window like the world was listening. Richard finally said, Arthur, I don't deserve your forgiveness. Arthur smiled faintly. I didn't offer it. Then, softer. But I do believe people can change, even the ones who think they're untouchable. Richard lowered his head. I don't know if I can. Arthur stood and walked him to the door. Then maybe start by trying. As Richard stepped out into the night, Arthur called after him. You were right about one thing, though. Richard turned. What's that? Arthur smiled. Drivers do end up going exactly where they're meant to. That night, Richard sat alone in his car. The city lights blurred through the raindrops, and for the first time, he didn't feel like the man in control of everything. He felt like the one being driven somewhere he didn't yet understand. He replayed Arthur's words again and again. Forgiveness isn't found in running away. Sometimes you have to face the man you used to be. Somewhere deep down, he knew. This wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning of something that might finally make him human again. Richard didn't go to work the next morning. For the first time in 20 years, the office ran without him, and no one dared to call and ask why. He spent the morning sitting by the window of his penthouse, staring at the skyline that once symbolized his power. It all looked the same, but he didn't feel like he belonged there anymore. His phone buzzed. Dozens of missed calls, urgent messages from investors, a reminder about the quarterly board meeting. He ignored them all. At 10:42 a.m., a single message arrived from an unknown number. He almost deleted it until he saw the name at the end. If you really meant what you said last night about wanting to try, meet me here. Arthur. Attached was a location pin. It wasn't a boardroom. It wasn't a 5-star restaurant. It was a place Richard hadn't visited in years, the South District, the part of the city he'd helped build on paper and helped destroy in practice. When his car pulled up, the contrast hit him like a memory. Cracked pavement, faded walls, children running barefoot through puddles. The last time he'd been here, he was cutting ribbons at a housing development. Months later, those homes were repossessed after his company raised property taxes to fund its expansion. Arthur stood by the entrance of a small community center, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand, talking with volunteers. He looked completely at home. Richard stepped out, feeling out of place in his tailored suit. Heads turned, people recognized him, some with admiration, most with anger. Arthur noticed and excused himself from the group. You came. Richard glanced around. I didn't think you'd expect me. Arthur smiled. I didn't, but I hoped you would. What is this place? Richard asked. Arthur gestured around. This was once the Blackridge complex. Now it's a learning center, free classes, after-school tutoring, meals for families who lost everything when your deal went through. The words stung, but Arthur didn't say them to wound. He said them like a man stating the truth. Richard looked at the faded mural on the wall, children holding hands, painted under the words, "Hope rises here." "Did you build all this?" he asked quietly. "Not alone," Arthur said. "The people did. I just helped them remember how." Arthur led him inside. The building smelled of chalk and bread, a strange but comforting mix. In one room, kids were reading aloud from donated books. In another, volunteers served soup to families sitting at long tables. A small girl ran up to Arthur and hugged his leg. "Mr. Arthur, I finished the story you gave me." "That's wonderful, Mia," he said, kneeling. "What was your favorite part?" "When the hero said sorry," she grinned. "Because he meant it." Arthur smiled. "That's the best part of any story." He looked up at Richard, whose face softened for a moment. They sat in the office, a tiny space with mismatched chairs and peeling paint. Arthur poured 2 coffees and handed one over. "You look uncomfortable." "I'm not used to being the poorest man in the room," Richard admitted. Arthur chuckled. "Then maybe it's time you learn how rich humility can make you." Richard stared into his cup. "You really think I can fix what I broke?" Arthur leaned back. "No, but you can stop it from breaking further." He handed Richard a file. "These are the families affected by the Blackridge deal. Many are still struggling. You could make things right, quietly." Richard opened the file. Names, faces, numbers. He'd seen millions of spreadsheets in his life, but never ones that looked this human. "How much would it take?" he asked automatically. Arthur gave a faint smile. "That's the wrong question." Richard frowned. "Then what's the right one?" Arthur looked at him. "How much are you willing to give up?" Over the next few weeks, Richard returned often. At first, he just watched, and the volunteers, the children, the laughter that filled every corner of the worn-down building. Then he started helping, quietly. He signed checks anonymously. He arranged new supplies. He spent time in classrooms listening to the children read stories that weren't about profit or loss, but about courage and kindness. And for the first time in years, something inside him began to thaw. Still, not everyone welcomed him. One evening, as he was leaving, a man approached him, tall, with paint-stained hands. "You're Hemsley," the man said, "the one who took everything from us." Richard froze. I lost my shop because of your merger," the man said, voice shaking. "You made your millions while we starved." Arthur stepped forward. "Mark, please." "No," the man snapped. "He doesn't get to play savior now." The crowd nearby fell silent. Richard didn't move. He could have walked away. He could have hidden behind security, excuses, money. Instead, he took a slow breath. "You're right," Richard said. "I did take everything, and I can't undo it. But I can spend what's left of my life trying to rebuild even a fraction of what I destroyed." The man stared at him, stunned. Arthur watched quietly as the anger in the man's eyes softened, not into forgiveness, but into something less poisonous. "Then start with my son's school," the man said finally. "The roof leaks." Richard nodded. "Tomorrow morning." Later that night, as they walked back to the parking lot, Arthur said quietly, "That's the first time you didn't try to defend yourself." Richard smiled faintly. "Didn't seem like the time to talk about market trends." Arthur chuckled. "Maybe you're learning." Richard looked at him. "Arthur, why are you helping me? After everything?" Arthur's smile faded. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it either." "Who?" Arthur's eyes glistened. "My father. He drove men like you, and one day I became one of them." Richard frowned. "He was a driver too." Arthur nodded. "Yes. Died behind the wheel of a car owned by a man who never even knew his name. That man was your father, Richard." The words hit like thunder. "My father?" Richard whispered. Arthur nodded slowly. "He was your family's driver, the one your father fired the week before the accident." Richard's knees weakened. I didn't know." Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you do." The world tilted. Richard felt the weight of every cruel word he'd ever said, every command, every insult. "I spent my life becoming the man who broke yours," Richard whispered. Arthur's voice was calm. Then maybe it's time you spend what's left of it becoming the man who heals others. That night Richard couldn't sleep. He stood by the window watching lightning cut across the sky, feeling the storm he'd carried for decades finally break open. He whispered to the empty room, "I will make it right." And this time he meant it. The following morning, Richard sat in his penthouse surrounded by silence that felt heavier than ever. The words from last night played on a loop in his head. "He was your family's driver, the one your father fired the week before the accident." He stared at an old photo on the mantel, his father shaking hands with politicians, his mother smiling beside him. Behind them, blurred in the corner, a man stood by a black car. Arthur's father. Richard never noticed him before, but now he couldn't stop seeing him. He grabbed his keys and drove straight to the archives of Hemsley Global Holdings. If there were records, contracts, anything that could confirm what Arthur said, he needed to see them. The receptionist tried to stop him. "Mr. Hemsley, you don't have clearance to access those files without the board's approval." "I own the name on the building," Richard said. "That's clearance enough." He spent hours digging through old boxes, payrolls, contracts, letters, until his hands were covered in dust and gilt. Finally, he found it. Employee record, George Dean. Position, chauffeur. Termination date, February 14th, 1994. Reason, alleged negligence. Vehicle damage, no injury. Below it, a note in his father's handwriting, disloyal. Replace immediately. And at the bottom, a short company memo. Deceased, car accident, 1 week later. Richard sank into the chair, the papers trembling in his hands. So it was true. His father, the man he'd spent his life trying to emulate, had ruined another man's life without even remembering his name. And now, decades later, he had unknowingly done the same to that man's son. That night, Richard returned to the South District. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and earth. He found Arthur locking up the community center. "I went through the records," Richard said quietly. "You were right." Arthur didn't answer. Richard swallowed hard. "Your father, he was loyal. My father treated him like nothing, and then Arthur interrupted gently. "You don't owe me an apology for what another man did." Richard shook his head. "No. But I owe him one. And I owe his son my truth." Arthur turned to face him, eyes tired but calm. "What do you want from me, Richard?" "Forgiveness." Arthur sighed. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for once. It's something you live every day until it earns its own name." Richard nodded slowly. "Then I'll start living it." The next day, Richard stood before his board for the first time in weeks. The room was filled with the scent of expensive suits and nervous ambition. He placed a folder on the table. "Effective immediately, all remaining profits from the Blackridge merger will be redirected to community rebuilding." One of the board members laughed. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Richard said. "Those profits came from people we left behind. We're giving them back." Another man sneered. "You'll bankrupt us." "No," Richard replied. "I'll save what's left of us." They argued, threatened, shouted, but Richard didn't flinch. When the meeting ended, half the board resigned. The rest stayed, stunned by a man they no longer recognized. That evening, Richard returned to the community center carrying blueprints. "I'm rebuilding," he told Arthur. "Not just this place and the whole district. New jobs, fair housing, funding for education, real change." Arthur studied him for a long moment. "You can't buy redemption, Richard." "I'm not trying to," he said. "I'm trying to deserve it." For the first time, Arthur smiled. "Then let's do it together." They shook hands. This time, not as employer and employee, but as equals. Weeks turned into months. The project grew faster than anyone expected. Old buildings were restored, new ones rose, and people started to believe again. Richard was there every day, not as a boss, but as a worker. He painted walls, planted trees, carried boxes. Children started recognizing him not as the man who ruined everything, but as Mr. Richard, the helper. But as hope returned, so did the people who wanted to destroy it. One afternoon, Branson, Richard's former partner and rival, showed up at the construction site. Well, well, Branson said, stepping out of his silver car. The great Hemsley reduced to a handyman. Richard didn't respond. Branson smirked. You're rebuilding slums with company money. That's embezzlement. The board's furious. Let them be, Richard said quietly. Branson circled him. You think these people will ever truly forgive you? You're a billionaire trying to buy sainthood. Richard's jaw tightened. No, I'm a man trying to earn peace. Branson chuckled darkly. Peace doesn't sell. He turned to leave, then added, You're going to lose everything, Richard. And when you do, I'll be there to take what's left. Arthur, who had overheard, stepped forward. You already took enough from this world. Maybe it's time someone gave something back. Branson glanced at him and laughed. Ah, the driver, still speaking like a philosopher. Tell me, does the boss pay you to preach? Arthur met his gaze. No, he pays me to drive, but I learned a long time ago. A man's direction matters more than his speed. Branson's smirk faded. He got in his car and drove off without another word. That night, Richard sat outside the half-finished community hall, looking up at the stars. Arthur joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. You handled that well. Richard smiled faintly. If it were a year ago, I'd have thrown him out of a window. Arthur laughed. Progress, then. They sat quietly for a while. Then Richard said softly, You know, I used to think men like me were above everyone else. But the truth is, we're just afraid. Afraid of being ordinary. Afraid of being seen. Arthur nodded. And now? Now I'm just afraid of going back to who I was. Arthur looked at him. You won't, because that man couldn't have said what you just did. The next morning, Richard found an envelope taped to the door of the community center. Inside was a legal notice. Subject: allegation of fraudulent redistribution of corporate funds. Plaintiff: Branson Holdings. At the bottom, court summons, 14 days. He felt his stomach drop. Arthur walked in and saw the paper. He's trying to destroy you. Richard nodded. And if he wins, everything we built goes with it. Arthur folded the notice and set it aside. Then we'll fight, not for the money, for the people. That evening, Richard called a press conference, the first one in years where he didn't wear a designer suit. He stood before a crowd of reporters and flashing cameras and said simply, I am guilty. I profited from others' pain. But I am not running anymore. Every dollar I made from injustice will now build something good, even if it costs me everything. The crowd erupted in questions, but he turned away, walking straight into the rain. Arthur was waiting by the car. You just ended your career, he said quietly. Richard looked at him. Maybe. But I finally started my life. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and tension. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture every flicker of shame on Richard Hemsley's face. For years, he had stood above the law, untouchable, untarnished. Now he stood alone at the defendant's table. No lawyers from his empire beside him, no shareholders in sight. At the opposite table sat Branson, calm, smug, surrounded by expensive attorneys. The man had always been a predator, but this time his prey wasn't a company. It was a reputation. Arthur sat quietly in the back row, a steady presence in the storm. When the judge entered, the whispers stopped. Branson's attorney began with a voice slick as oil. Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Richard Hemsley, illegally redirected corporate funds for personal image rehabilitation under the guise of philanthropy. He used the resources of Hemsley Global Holdings to rebuild a district he himself destroyed, without shareholder approval. He turned toward the cameras. We are not here to discuss morality, but theft. Richard didn't flinch. He'd already accepted that the world would see him as guilty. The only thing that mattered now was whether truth would survive the noise. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stood slowly. No suit, no pretense, just a man stripped of everything but honesty. Your Honor, he began. For most of my life, I believed that success excused anything, greed, cruelty, even silence. I was wrong. What I did wasn't theft. It was restitution. The money I used didn't belong to me, but neither did the suffering it caused. The courtroom murmured. Branson's lawyer scoffed. So you admit you stole? Richard met his gaze. No, I returned what was never mine to keep. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. During a recess, Richard stepped outside for air. Rain had begun to fall again, steady and cold, as if the sky itself was cleansing the city of its sins. Arthur joined him under the awning. "How do you feel?" he asked. Richard smiled faintly. "Like I've already lost, but maybe losing is what I needed." Arthur looked at him. "You know, when I first started driving for you, I used to think you'd never look at anyone unless they were above you." Richard exhaled. "And now?" Arthur's eyes softened. "Now I see a man finally learning to look people in the eye." Back inside, Branson's lawyer called witnesses, former board members, investors, anyone who would paint Richard as reckless and manipulative. But then the defense called Arthur Dean. He walked to the stand calmly, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Dean," the lawyer began, "you were Mr. Hemsley's driver?" "Yes," Arthur replied. "And before that?" Arthur hesitated, then spoke clearly. "I was his company's chief financial officer." The courtroom gasped. Branson leaned forward. "Objection irrelevant." The judge motioned for silence. "Overruled. Continue." Arthur nodded. "I worked for Mr. Hemsley's father before him. My own father was their driver until he was fired unjustly. I joined this company believing I could make it better. I failed." He turned to Richard. "But he didn't." The lawyer frowned. "Mr. Dean, are you saying you approve of Mr. Hemsley's actions?" Arthur smiled faintly. "I'm saying I witnessed something I thought I'd never see. A man with everything choosing to give it all away." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Dean, in your opinion, did the defendant act out of greed or guilt?" Arthur looked straight ahead. "Neither, Your Honor. He acted out of love." The courtroom went silent. When the trial adjourned for the day, reporters swarmed the steps outside. Microphones flashed. Questions flew. "Mr. Hemsley, are you trying to save your image? Do you admit to fraud? Do you regret anything?" Richard paused, then said quietly, "I regret waiting this long to become human." The cameras went wild. Arthur guided him away through the chaos, down the courthouse steps and into the car. That night the city glowed with headlines. Billionaire faces collapse, but wins hearts with unexpected speech. Driver reveals hidden past in emotional testimony. From greed to grace, the fall of Richard Hemsley. Richard sat alone reading every line, not out of pride but disbelief. He'd spent his life buying headlines. Now, for the first time, one had been earned. Days later, the verdict arrived. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. "Mr. Hemsley, this court recognizes that while your actions breached corporate procedure, your intent and transparency mitigate criminal liability. You will forfeit all remaining shares in Hemsley Global Holdings and be permanently removed from its leadership." He paused. "However, given your efforts toward restitution, this court will not impose imprisonment." A collective gasp filled the room. Branson's face twisted with fury. Richard closed his eyes. Relief, sadness, freedom, all at once. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Arthur met him at the steps. "You did it." "No," Richard said softly. "We did it." Branson shoved past the crowd, sneering. "You think you've won? You've lost everything." Richard turned to him. "You're wrong. I finally know what everything actually means." Branson laughed bitterly. "You'll die poor." Richard smiled. "Then I'll die clean." Branson stormed off, swallowed by the crowd and his own emptiness. Weeks later, Richard's penthouse stood empty. He sold it all, the cars, the paintings, the company stock, and poured every cent into rebuilding the South District. He moved into a small apartment beside the community center, the same one Arthur once called home. Every morning they worked side by side. Children ran past them, laughter echoing through streets once haunted by despair. And sometimes, when the day ended, Richard would look at Arthur and say, "I still can't believe how much I didn't see when I had everything." Arthur would smile. "Maybe you needed to lose it to see clearly." One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Arthur handed Richard a letter. "What's this?" "It's from the foundation board," Arthur said. They want you to take my place, Director of Operations. Richard shook his head. No, that's your role. Arthur smiled. It was my father's wish that I serve those who once looked down on us. I've done that. Now it's your turn. Richard hesitated, eyes glistening. I'm not sure I'm ready. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. No one ever is, but you're finally the kind of man this place deserves. That night, Richard stood in the empty hall of the community center. Children's drawings lined the walls, bright suns, smiling faces, words like, "Thank you, Mr. Richard." He smiled through tears. For the first time in decades, he felt peace, not as the man who owned the city, but as the man who helped rebuild it. Outside, Arthur locked up and looked toward the horizon. Their stories, two men bound by pain, divided by pride, reunited by purpose, had finally converged. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the noise of the city, the spirits of two fathers, one who drove, one who ruled, finally rested too. 6 months later, the headlines had moved on. The city that once whispered Richard Hemsley's name now barely remembered it. The man who had ruled skyscrapers now swept the floor of a small classroom filled with laughter and crayons. Children ran past him shouting, "Mr. Richard, come see my drawing." He smiled, kneeling beside a boy who'd drawn two men holding hands under a bright sun. "Who are they?" Richard asked. The boy grinned. "You and Mr. Arthur, you fixed the broken city." Richard's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, kid." The boy frowned. "Are you sad?" Richard smiled through the ache. "No, I'm proud." Arthur entered, carrying boxes of books. His hair had grown silver at the edges, but his eyes were the same. Calm, knowing, kind. "Still hiding from the board meetings," he teased. Richard laughed softly. "I think I've met my quota of boardrooms for one lifetime." Arthur smiled. "You know, people don't talk about you anymore." "I noticed," Richard said quietly. "Feels strange, doesn't it? To do good and disappear." Arthur leaned against the doorframe. "That's the point of doing good, Richard. It's supposed to outlive your name." That afternoon, the two men walked through the newly built streets, now alive with children playing, vendors shouting, laughter echoing off walls painted in colors of hope. Richard stopped at a small bakery. The smell of warm bread filled the air. A woman behind the counter smiled. "You're Mr. Hemsley, aren't you?" He hesitated. "I used to be." She placed a loaf in a paper bag and pushed it toward him. "You paid for my son's scholarship. You didn't even know us. Thank you." He smiled faintly. "How's he doing?" "Graduating next month," she said proudly. "He wants to be a teacher, like Mr. Arthur." Richard blinked away tears. "Tell him, the world needs more like him." That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Richard and Arthur stood on the roof of the community center, watching the city glow gold. "You ever think about the past?" Richard asked. Arthur chuckled. "Every day. But I stopped letting it own me." Richard nodded. "I'm still learning how." Arthur looked at him. "Then keep learning. That's what makes us alive." The wind picked up, carrying the sound of children's laughter below. For the first time, it didn't sound distant. It sounded like music. Later that night, Richard sat alone in his small apartment. He looked at an old photo of his father again. This time he didn't feel anger, only understanding. He whispered, "You built towers. I broke them. But maybe now, we're finally even." He placed the photo beside a new one, of him and Arthur surrounded by the children, two men, two legacies, one redemption. Then he opened a letter that had arrived earlier that day. To Mr. Richard Hemsley, from the City Council of Blackridge. "We hereby announce the opening of the Dean Hemsley Learning Center, dedicated to the memory of George Dean and the contribution of Richard Hemsley to community restoration." Richard froze, his hand trembling. They'd used both names. He smiled. "He'll like that," he murmured. The next morning, Arthur arrived early, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Big day," he said. "You ready?" Richard grinned. "Not for speeches, you'll handle that." Arthur smirked. "We'll see." The ceremony drew hundreds of people, Families, children, volunteers, reporters. A new plaque shone in the sunlight. The Dean Hemsley Learning Centre. From power came pride, from humility came hope. Arthur stood before the crowd, his voice steady. Today isn't about wealth or loss. It's about the truth that built this place, that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it rebuilds the future. He looked at Richard. And no man is too far gone to find his way home. The crowd applauded, but Richard didn't step forward. He simply stood among them, clapping like everyone else, eyes glistening. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Arthur found him sitting alone on a bench beneath a tree. "You should have spoken," Arthur said gently. Richard smiled. "I did. Through you." Arthur sat beside him. "You've changed, Richard." He nodded. "I had to. The world needed a better version of me." Arthur looked away, the breeze lifting his hair. "I think you found him." As the sun began to set, Arthur's phone buzzed. He frowned, then smiled. "What is it?" Richard asked. Arthur handed him the phone. On the screen was a video, the children of the centre singing a song they'd written. "He built us a place, he taught us to care, not from his riches, but from the heart he bare." Richard covered his mouth, overcome with emotion. Arthur said quietly, "That's your legacy now." Richard looked at him through tears. "Then it was worth everything I lost." That night, Richard walked home alone. The streets were quiet, the stars bright above. Halfway down the road, he saw a familiar car parked at the curb, an old model Bentley, polished but aged. The driver's door was open. Arthur stood beside it, looking at him with that same calm smile. "Need a ride, Mr. Hemsley?" Richard laughed. "Funny, I thought I was done being driven." Arthur tilted his head. "Maybe just one last time." They both got in. As the engine started, the headlights illuminated the road ahead. Not grand, not paved in gold, but honest. Arthur glanced at him. "Where to?" Richard smiled softly. "Anywhere people still need us." Hours later, the Bentley disappeared into the quiet streets. Two men, once divided by pride, now united by purpose. And in the reflection of the rearview mirror, the city lights glowed like forgiveness itself. The years that followed were quiet ones. The city had changed. No longer a skyline of greed and steel, but a living, breathing story of resilience. Children who once studied in the Dean Hemsley Centre had grown into teachers, builders and dreamers. And through it all, Richard and Arthur remained there, the unlikely architects of hope. But time, as it always does, began to demand its due. Arthur's hair turned fully silver. His steps slowed. He still smiled, still worked, but there were days when his hands trembled as he lifted books, and nights when he didn't show up at the community dinners. Richard noticed. "Arthur," he said one afternoon, as they sorted donated clothes, "you've been coughing more lately. Maybe you should see a doctor." Arthur waved it off with his usual calm humor. "Doctors are for men afraid of the truth. I've already made peace with mine." Richard frowned. "Don't joke about that." Arthur smiled faintly. "Who's joking?" Weeks later, the winter came harsh and sudden. Richard found Arthur sitting alone in the empty classroom, staring out the window as snow fell outside. "You're still here?" Richard asked softly. Arthur turned slowly, his face pale but peaceful. "Just making sure everything's ready for tomorrow's class." "You need rest." "I'll rest when I'm done teaching," Arthur replied. Richard sat beside him. "You've already taught enough." Arthur looked at him, eyes full of quiet warmth. "Then you weren't listening." Richard chuckled. "I've been listening for years." Arthur's smile deepened. "Then hear this one last time. Redemption isn't a destination, Richard. It's a daily road. You don't walk it to forget what you were. You walk it to remember who you became." Richard swallowed hard. "You talk like a man saying goodbye." Arthur looked back out the window. "Maybe I am." A few days later, Arthur didn't show up for work. When Richard went to his apartment, the door was unlocked. The lights were off. A faint sound of labored breathing came from the bedroom. He rushed inside. Arthur lay in bed, frail but still dignified. "You shouldn't have come," Arthur said weakly. I shouldn't have waited this long, Richard replied, sitting beside him. Arthur's eyes softened. You remember what you said the first day I drove for you? Richard frowned. No. You told me drivers have nowhere better to go. Richard closed his eyes. I was an arrogant fool. Arthur smiled faintly. Maybe. But look at you now. You've driven farther than anyone I know. Silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking clock. Richard took his hand. You're not leaving yet, Arthur, not like this. Arthur's voice was calm. Everything ends, Richard. Even the best journeys. What matters is how much good you leave on the road behind you. A tear slid down Richard's cheek. You changed me, Arthur. You showed me what it meant to be human. Arthur's hand trembled slightly as he squeezed Richard's. No, Richard, you showed yourself. I just held up the mirror. His breath grew shallow. Promise me something, Arthur whispered. Anything. Don't stop driving. Richard's lips trembled. Where would I even go? Arthur smiled, a soft, peaceful smile. Wherever someone still believes they're too far gone. His eyes closed. The room fell silent. And for the first time since that rainy day years ago, the driver's seat was empty. The funeral was small, no luxury cars, no marble tombs, just friends, children, families, and one man standing in the cold, unable to speak. Arthur Dean was buried beneath a tree behind the community centre. The plaque on his grave read simply, he drove others, but led them home. Richard stood there long after everyone had left, snow melting on his coat. He whispered, You did, Arthur, you led me home. Months passed. Richard ran the centre alone, but it didn't feel the same. The rooms echoed differently without Arthur's quiet presence. One morning, as he was cleaning Arthur's old office, he found a small sealed envelope in the desk drawer. His name was written on it. He opened it slowly. Dear Richard, if you're reading this, I've already taken my last drive. Don't mourn me. Men like us spend too long mourning what's lost. It's time we learn to celebrate what remains. You once asked me how much a man should give up for forgiveness. I never answered because the truth is, forgiveness isn't a trade. It's a gift we give ourselves when we stop being who we were. I leave this centre to you not as a burden but as a compass. Keep driving, Richard. The road is long, but you're finally on the right one. Arthur. Richard pressed the letter to his chest, tears falling silently. He whispered, You never stopped teaching, did you? That night, Richard walked through the city alone. Every streetlight flicker reminded him of their long talks, every passing car of their shared journey. He stopped by the old Bentley, still parked near the centre. Its keys hung by the mirror, a note attached, For when the road calls again. He sat inside, the leather cracked, the wheel worn smooth from years of hands that had seen too much. He started the engine. The sound filled the silence like a heartbeat returning. He drove through the city slowly, past the new schools, the rebuilt homes, the laughter that echoed through the windows. As he passed the mural on the community wall, Hope rises here, he smiled. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant. He whispered, I'll keep driving, Arthur, I promise. And with that, he turned onto the open road, headlights cutting through the fog, his reflection steady in the mirror. Not the man he used to be, but the man he'd become. Years passed. The world changed again. New buildings rose, faces grew older, and the city that once drowned in greed now breathed with grace. But one thing remained untouched. The Dean Hemsley Learning Centre. Children still laughed in its hallways, and teachers still told the story of two men, one who drove and one who learned to follow. A story about pride, forgiveness, and the long road to redemption. It was a summer morning when a young boy named Ethan found the old Bentley. The car sat under a faded tarp beside the community garage, forgotten by most, remembered by few. The boy peeked inside, eyes wide. Dust covered everything, but the leather still carried a faint scent, something warm, something like memory. He climbed in, pretending to drive, hands gripping the wheel that had once guided two very different men. Hey! A voice called from behind. Ethan turned. An elderly man with grey hair and kind eyes stood at the door. Sorry, sir, Ethan said quickly. I didn't mean to. The man chuckled. It's all right, kid. That car's got more stories than the library across the street. Ethan grinned. Whose was it? The man's smile softened. It belonged to Mr. Richard Hemsley. He helped build this place. Before that, he helped tear it down. The boy frowned. That doesn't make sense. The man nodded. It didn't make sense to him either. Not until he met someone named Arthur. The man opened the car door and sat beside the boy. Arthur Dean, he was a driver. Quiet, wise, patient. The kind of man who could teach you something without saying a word. Ethan listened, eyes wide. Mr. Hemsley was rich. Too rich to notice the world outside his window. But Arthur made him see what money never could. People. He pointed to the mural on the wall across the street. The boy read the faded words aloud. Hope rises here. Arthur painted that, the old man said. Mr. Hemsley helped him rebuild the whole district. Ethan blinked. So they were friends? The man smiled. They became brothers, not by blood, by choice. Ethan leaned forward, eyes shining. Where are they now? The man sighed. Arthur's been gone for years, and Mr. Hemsley, well, he followed not long after. The boy looked sad. So the story's over? The man shook his head. No, kid, the road never ends. They just pass the wheel to others, people like you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old key, its metal worn smooth by time. Go on, he said, handing it to the boy. Start it. Ethan hesitated, then turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life. The boy gasped. It still works. The man smiled. Some things never die, son, especially when they were built on purpose. The sound of the engine echoed through the neighborhood, drawing people out of nearby shops and classrooms. Old teachers smiled, recognizing the familiar sound. Some of them whispered, "He's driving again." Ethan looked at the man. "Can I take it for a spin?" The man laughed softly. "You're too young for the open road, but maybe you can take it around the block just to keep the wheels turning." The boy grinned and nodded. "I'll bring it back." As the Bentley rolled forward, the man stood watching, his reflection flickering faintly in the window. For a moment he looked younger. His smile looked familiar, almost like Arthur's. Ethan steered carefully, feeling the hum of history beneath his hands. He didn't understand the full story, not yet, but he felt it. The weight of kindness, the strength of humility, the power of forgiveness. As he passed the mural, sunlight hit the car just right, glinting off the polished hood, casting a warm glow that stretched across the street. He could almost hear two voices, one calm, one strong, and echoing in his mind. "Keep driving, Richard. Wherever someone still believes they're too far gone." When Ethan returned, the man was gone. Only the car remained, idling quietly, as if waiting for its next driver. The boy stepped out and looked around. Then he noticed something carved into the bench nearby. He brushed away the dust and read aloud. He drove others but led them home. A.D. He lost everything but found himself. R.H. The boy smiled, placing the key back on the seat. He whispered, "Thank you." Then he walked away, the echo of the engine fading behind him, but the warmth of its sound stayed like a heartbeat in the heart of the city. Years later, that same boy, now grown, stood on a stage at the Dean Hemsley Center. Behind him hung the old mural, newly restored. In his hand was a small, worn key. He lifted it toward the crowd and said, "This key doesn't open doors. It opens lives. 2 men once taught us that the road to forgiveness is never closed. It just waits for someone brave enough to drive it again." The audience rose in applause. And as the lights dimmed, a single spotlight fell on the mural's words, "Hope rises here." The camera slowly panned out, fading to the city skyline at dusk, the same one Richard once ruled, now reborn through grace. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of an engine starting, steady, timeless, eternal. The road continued,